Hello everyone, today I will be going over the jecs library, which I consider to be the best ECS library on Roblox. For those who don't know, an ECS stands for Entity Component System, and this programming paradigm consists of three elements. Entities, which are like IDs that can be used to represent data stored by components, which are like attributes or tags for your entities that can be used by the system, which refers to the logic that modifies your data. An ECS takes a different approach to state management as opposed to object-oriented programming, or OOP for short, where the main difference is that objects contain data while entities do not. For example, if you wanted to create a mesh on an OOP-based approach like Roblox, you would create a mesh part object and then modify the object mesh's properties directly. Meanwhile, on an ECS-based approach like Unity, you would create an entity with a mesh component and you would modify the mesh properties on the component rather than the entity itself. This approach to state management is extremely beneficial in terms of performance in scenarios where you need to rapidly iterate through tons of similar elements in quick succession. An example would be bullet physics, where we would need to update the positions of potentially hundreds of bullets every single physics frame. Another example would be creating a custom NPC AI. Because humanoids on Roblox are computationally expensive, you will start to have significant performance issues after adding like 50 or 100 NPCs in your game. Instead, we can create an NPC that does not use a humanoid and then animate it using an ECS to update its position and behavior state every physics frame. With this approach, you could create hundreds, if not thousands, of NPCs without any performance issues. The reason why ECS is so efficient with processing large iterations of elements is because ECS is data oriented, which basically means that ECS organizes state in a structured way to optimize performance, something OOP is not well known for. Anyways, now that we understand what ECS is, now let's get to installing jecs. If you use Rojo for programming on Roblox with VS Code, then you should install jecs using Wally. Specifically, look for the jecs package by Ukendio. If you are scripting in Plain Studio, then download the RBXM file on the latest release on the jecs GitHub page. Then drag and drop the downloaded RBXM file into Studio, and you should be good from there. To get started, we need to create a world, which simply refers to the container for our entities and components. For example, you can create a world that only focuses on bullet projection, and then create another world for your enemy AIs, since the two don't need to mix together. However, in most scenarios, you only need one world. To create a component, call the world component method. If you want to treat your component like a tag, meaning that you don't want to attach any data to a component, then you can leave it like that. However, if you want to treat your component like an attribute, meaning that you do want to attach data to your component, then make sure to typecast your component to jecs.entity with the component's intended data type inside the angle brackets. However, if you're not using strict type checking, then you can just skip this step. To create an entity, simply call the world entity method. To add a component tag to an entity, call the world add method, which takes in the entity as the first argument and the component as the second argument. To add a component attribute to an entity, call the world set method, which behaves like world add except you have an attribute value as the third argument. To get the value of a component attribute, call the world get method with the entity and the component as the respective arguments again. To remove a component from an entity, call the world remove method. Again, it takes in the entity and component as respective arguments. To remove all components from an entity, call the world clear method, which takes in the entity as the only argument. To destroy an entity or component, call the world delete method and put in whatever you're trying to destroy as the argument. So yeah, those are the basic operations you can do on entities and components, though jecs does offer many more methods that you can find in the official jecs documentation. Now let's do some querying. To iterate through all entities that have a specific component, you can call world query in a for loop and add the component as the arguments of the query method. In return, it will give us the entity and the component value as the iteration variables. Keep in mind that the query method should be used for component attributes, not tags. You can also query multiple components at the same time. Because the query argument is variadic, this means that we can add additional components as additional arguments, but this also means that the query will only iterate through entities that have all components specified in the query. You can also chain methods on queries as well. For example, you can call the with method on the query and add component tags as the arguments of this with method. This will tell the query to only iterate through an entity if it has all the specified component tags. Conversely, you can also use the without method, which basically tells the query not to iterate through an entity if it has any of the specified component tags. Another method of iteration is to use the world each method, which takes in a component as the argument. This will iterate through all the entities that have the specified component. This can be useful for iterating with component tags, since the each method is for when you care about the entity but not the value of the component. By the way, because components also act like entities, this means that you can use all of these world methods on components as well. This feature will be useful for the next section of this video, which is about relationships in jecs. This concept may be confusing at first, but essentially a relationship in jecs just means this entity is connected with this other entity in a specified way. To accomplish this, we can use the jecs.pair constructor, which contains two arguments, the relationship and the target, and both arguments can either be an entity or a component. The relationship is essentially how we want to relate the source entity with the target entity. An example is jecs.childof, which allows for parent-child relationships just like Roblox has. So for this example, let's just use child of as our relationship. So let's create a parent entity and a child entity. We start off by creating a pair where we use jecs.childof as the relationship and the parent entity as the target. To add the relationship to the child entity, we add our newly formed pair to the child entity like it's a component, because in a way a pair does act like a component. With pairs, you can add a special cleanup behavior to components. To do so, add a pair to the component where the relationship is the cleanup condition and the target is the cleanup action. For cleanup conditions, you have onDelete, which means that your component was deleted, and onDeleteTarget, which means that an entity that uses your component was deleted. For cleanup actions, you have remove, which means to remove the component from all entities, and delete, which means to delete all entities that have your component. Jex's built-in child of relationship actually uses this cleanup behavior, where deleting a parent will also delete all the child entities in relation to that parent. You can also use the world target method to find the target entity of a source entity in a relationship. The target method takes in the source entity as the first argument and the relationship as the second argument. Additionally, you can add a third argument, the index, to specify which target to find in the case that your source entity has multiple targets of the same relationship. Note that the index parameter starts at 0 and not 1. Additionally, you can use jecs.wildcard, which refers to a value that can be any type. This is useful for when you want to query a pair with a certain relationship, but you don't necessarily care about the exact target of the relationship. Additionally, you can add hooks to a component, which are basically just event listeners. Jex supports three types of hooks: onAdd, onRemove, and onChange. These hooks act like components themselves, so you would attach them to your normal component using the world set method, where the hook is the second argument, and you would set a callback function as the third argument of the set method. This callback function will contain two arguments itself, the entity that triggered the hook and the ID of your component. For onAdd and onChange, there will also be a third argument, the attribute value of the component for the entity in question, assuming that your component is an attribute and not a tag. The reason why the second argument for the callback is the component ID is because sometimes the argument can change, specifically when the component is used as a relationship for a pair. In that case, the component ID will reference the pair instead. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope this helped you with understanding how jex works. Thanks for watching, and if you want to learn more about jex, I will put the official documentation link in the description. Thank you.